January 1865, Savannah, Georgia. 10 black teachers have just been examined and found competent to teach. And the most available building in the city for a school for free children is a slave market. The old Bryan Slave Mart. Until recently, the pen where relatives of many of these same freed people were sold. Somebody pried the bars off the stalls so benches could go in. Sit with that image, because this whole episode lives inside it. A freedmen's school met inside the pen families had been sold from. Here's the question that scene opens. In the short window when black Southerners could vote, hold office, and govern, what did they actually build? You already know the word history handed you about those governments. The word is corruption. This episode is about what the receipts say instead, and it ends at the strangest sentence in the book, about what the South actually feared. It isn't what you were taught. Start where the last episode ended. In part 1, W.E.B. Du Bois made the case that the enslaved weren't handed freedom. They took it. In what he calls a general strike that came to involve perhaps 500,000 people walking off the plantations and carrying their labor to the other side. His book, Black Reconstruction, published in 1935, spends its middle chapters on the harder question: freedom for what? 4 million people came out of bondage without land or capital, the minimum Du Bois says freedom required in order to be free. And every organized power Du Bois tracks had a plan for them. The South fought every larger version of freedom, step by step. Emancipation hollowed out, no schooling for black children, no vote. Northern industry wanted labor legally free, but without special protection, capital, or political power, the same terms it offered any immigrant laborer. Everybody had a plan for the freed people, except, supposedly, the freed people. Du Bois breaks that assumption first. Between 1864 and 1866, black conventions gathered in Nashville, in Raleigh, in Charleston, in Mobile, in Augusta, and up north in Syracuse, petitioning for wages, for schools, for legal protection of their families, for the ballot. In Mississippi, where prejudice made open assembly all but impossible, 437,404 citizens, a majority in that state by nearly 100,000, petitioned through a few delegates. Underneath all of it, 2 demands, repeating like a heartbeat: a piece of land to stand on, and a school. Land meant independence from the old master, and the school, Du Bois argues, is where this class parted from every other in the region. They connected knowledge with power. Emancipation had landed on them like scripture, and what they did with the joy was strikingly practical. Du Bois closes the war story with one sentence, and I want you to hear how much program is packed inside it. He wrote, quote, "Free, then, with a desire for land and a frenzy for schools, the Negro lurched into the new day." End quote. A desire for land, a frenzy for schools. Not a frenzy for revenge, which is what so much of the white South braced for, an agenda. Hold on to both planks. The rest of this episode is what happened to each one. That agenda had allies. Du Bois calls them abolition democracy. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner out front, the wing of the North that understood emancipation as a beginning rather than a receipt. Their program, in his listing, train the freed people in intelligence, in experience, and in labor. Open land and capital to black ownership. Make civil rights real in exercise and political power real in use. It's the freed people's own 2-plank agenda, land and schooling, with the legal machinery bolted on. Stevens, near the end of his life, proposed the concrete version. Confiscate the estates of about 70,000 leading rebels, 394 million acres, and cut 40 of those acres for every adult freedman. That was the foundation plank, the one that made all the others load-bearing. It never passed. Sumner pressed for what Du Bois calls the economic and educational minimum, and lost. And Du Bois records him going home from that defeat in tears. In Du Bois's account, the settlement that survived was the ballot, not land. The Reconstruction Acts made black male suffrage a condition of readmission across the former Confederacy, and by 1870, the 15th Amendment nailed it into the Constitution. The celebrated version is a moral awakening, America extending democracy at last. Du Bois looked at the same votes and saw a transaction. Here's the sentence, and I keep circling back to it because it's the coldest one in this stretch of the book. He wrote, quote, "Votes for Negroes were in truth a final compromise between business and abolition, and were forced on abolition by business as the only method of realizing the basic principles of abolition democracy." End quote. Forced on abolition by business. The idealists didn't win the argument. They were handed the one item on their list that asked nothing of property. Land redistribution costs money and rearranges power. A funded Freedmen's Bureau, the agency whose records include 21 million rations issued, 50,000 labor contracts written in a single state, and, by the summer of 1870, 250,000 pupils in more than 4,000 schools, costs money every single year. Federal support for it was vetoed, narrowed, and allowed to die. A ballot. To property, suffrage was the cheaper concession. No confiscation, no annual appropriation. So the freedmen got the vote the way a worker gets a title instead of a raise. And notice what that substitution quietly assumed. It assumed the ballot was safe, that paper power in the hands of people who had come out of slavery without land or capital would never move anything real. What comes next is how wrong that assumption was, and the price of proving it wrong. To test what black political power did with a cheap tool, go where that power was unusually strong: South Carolina, a state where black voters were an outright majority, 80,000 registered against 47,000 white. If the corruption story is true anywhere, it should be truest here, which is why Du Bois builds his case on it, and why this episode does. In 1868, the state elected delegates to a constitutional convention, and of the 124, 76 were black men. 57 of them had been born enslaved. The white press arrived expecting bedlam, and Charleston's own hostile daily ended up conceding in print that the best men in the hall were the colored members, and that they carried themselves with remarkable moderation and dignity. One of them, Beverly Nash, introduced by Du Bois as born in slavery, a waiter who learned his letters as an adult, stood up and granted the enemy's whole premise. His people were not ready for this suffrage. Then he turned it over, arguing that you put tools in a man's hands, he starts to use them, and in time, he has the trade. And voting is a trade. And here's what that convention and the legislatures after it actually made: a constitution with the most liberal suffrage provisions the South had seen. And when white supremacists took the state back by force, they governed under that same constitution for 18 more years. The state's first universal free public school system. Taxation of property at a scale the state had never seen, where antebellum land taxes had averaged under 5 cents an acre, and even the new rates ran at less than half of what Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania were charging property in the same years. Married women's property rights, the state's first divorce law. An end to imprisonment for debt. A land commission selling plots of 25 to 100 acres to actual settlers. Land ownership was changing too. Du Bois quotes the state's own 1883 handbook. By 1880, the 33,000 plantations of 1860 had been divided among 93,000 small farmers. Not the 40 acres Stevens wanted, but ground moving all the same. Now, the other half of the ledger, said in full because Du Bois says it in full. There was theft. The administration of Governor Franklin Moses was, in Du Bois's own words, the most corrupt of the period. Legislators sold favors. Some took bribes. Some of what went missing was school money. And some of the hands in the till belonged to the freed people's own representatives. That one should sting. It was the freed people's own plank being skimmed. If your instinct right now is that a government that can't police its own treasury forfeits its mandate, hold that instinct honestly. It's the exact case the world made, and it deserves a real answer. Du Bois's answer is an audit. Follow each major fraud to its principles, and you find, over and over, white men. The bond rings were run by Wall Street operators in partnership with respectable Native Carolinians. The bought Senate seat was bought by a white man to beat a black candidate who had already refused a $10,000 bribe to step aside. Even the state's crushing debt was partly manufactured. The planter press threatened repudiation. Klan violence helped destroy the state's credit. And so $3.2 million in cash cost $9.5 million in bonds. And the official indictment, the fraud report itself, written in 1877 by the men who had just seized the state by force and fraud and had every political incentive to make theft the story. A sympathetic British member of Parliament touring the South called the report an indictment rather than a judgment. And when he asked whether the black legislatures had made bad laws, his informants could not say they did. Du Bois runs the books and writes the finding in one sentence. He wrote, quote, "This brings us to the center of the corruption charge, which was, in fact, that poor men were ruling and taxing rich men." End quote. That's the decode. Corruption was the name property gave to the experience of being governed by its former labor. And the claim is not that the theft was imaginary. Du Bois never says it was. The claim is that theft was not the cause of death. In South Carolina, his chronology points to force, not graft, as the decisive cause. The strongest evidence is in the clock. By the mid-1870s, reform was winning, and black legislators were central to the coalition doing the reforming. Did the schools stall under the graft? Enrollment in the state went from 16,000 children in 1869 to 123,000 by 1876, even with school funds skimmed along the way. Did the graft kill the debt work? Black legislators sifted an alleged $2 million floating debt down to a verified $250,000, stamped $6 million in fraudulent bonds as fraudulent, and helped put the reform Governor Chamberlain in office in 1874. The man leading that stamping was Francis Cardozo, the black state treasurer, Glasgow educated, accused often by his enemies, and never once proven dishonest. A black former legislator named Thomas Miller stood up in 1895, inside the very convention that was stripping his people's vote, and read the record into its face. He said, quote, "We were 8 years in power. We had built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions," end quote. And he kept going. Through the penitentiary system, the education of the deaf and dumb, the rebuilt jails and courthouses, the bridges, the ferries. Same speech, he reminded them that 30-odd black legislators had settled the state's debt crisis and saved it $13 million. That's what was on the table in 1876, when the campaign of organized force, known as the Mississippi Plan, took the state back. And here is where the comfortable reading breaks. The inherited story. The one Part 1 watched being manufactured says corruption is why these governments fell. I'm telling you, the record runs the other way. If reform was succeeding when force ended the regime, then corruption cannot be the primary explanation that story makes it. Reform was succeeding. The regime was ended by force. Here is the sentence this entire episode turns on. Du Bois wrote, quote, "If there was one thing that South Carolina feared more than bad Negro government, it was good Negro government." End quote. It reads like a typo the first time. It isn't. Bad government by black men was useful. It made the case for taking the state back. Good government by black men was intolerable because it destroyed that case forever. In Part 1, the cover story word was failure. Here, it's corruption. Both words have done the same work. They keep the one question from ever being asked. What exactly was working at the moment somebody reached over and turned it off? So the governments fell. The counter-revolution took the ballot back piece by piece. Most direct political power went with it: the offices, the voting power, the equal claim on the treasury. Go back to the two planks from the beginning: land and school. The federal land redistribution plank had already died in Congress, and what land change came piecemeal. The school plank refused to die. Du Bois states it as plainly as he states anything in the book. He wrote, quote, "Public education for all at public expense was, in the South, a Negro idea." End quote. When you reach that sentence, the instinct is to read it again, because it sounds like it can't be literal. It's literal. Before the war, the Southern elite refused on principle to be taxed to educate anybody's labor, and teaching an enslaved person to read was a crime. Poor whites had learned to treat school as a luxury that belonged to wealth. The freed people had connected knowledge with power when nobody else in the region did. There's a real objection here, and it deserves its full weight. The early money and the early teachers were largely Northern. The Freedmen's Bureau spent over $5 million on education. Missionary societies sent Northern teachers south. In 1865 and 1866, the teachers in the black elementary schools were almost exclusively Northern whites. If outsiders paid the first bills and staffed the first classrooms, in what sense was the public school a Negro idea? The objection owns a lot, and Du Bois concedes it. Without the Northern money and teachers, those first years would have been far smaller and more fragile. His answer is a division of labor, and the test of it is what happened when the outside support thinned. After 1876, the Bureau was long dead, and the early outside support was no longer enough to carry the system. What stayed standing was the part the freed people owned, the demand and the constitutions their votes had written it into. They put their own money in before and while the first state systems were being written. Between 1866 and 1870, nearly $800,000 of their own scarce cash went into their own schools. In Louisiana, when the schools were about to close, 10,000 freed people signed a petition 30 feet long, most of them signing with marks, because writing was the very thing that had been kept from them. And they offered to pay a special tax to keep the doors open. People one step out of slavery, most of those signers using marks, petitioning for the right to be taxed. Booker T. Washington, who lived it, remembered an entire race heading to school at once, the old beside the young. People in their 50s and 70s in the night classes, whose one ambition, he said, was to hold the Bible and read it for themselves before they died. It's the Savannah scene again, multiplied across the South. Then the ballot arrived, and that hunger became law. The new Southern constitutions, written between 1867 and 1869, established universal, tax-funded public schools, and in 7 states, they carried a structural invention those states had never seen: direct state taxation dedicated to education. The counter-revolution looted the system, but could not repeal the idea. Georgia's Redeemer legislature destroyed $350,000 in school bonds. Virginia's diverted $1 million. Black schools were starved deep into the 20th century, and Du Bois, writing in 1935, could already document black children receiving between 1/2 and 1/10 of what the white child received. That starvation hardened into decades of policy, the dual systems Du Bois measured in 1935. And there is a later echo, in a different corner of black public education, a pattern he would have recognized: keep the institution, starve its share. In September 2023, the federal government sent letters to 16 governors, documenting that the state's 1890 land-grant HBCUs had been underfunded relative to their non-HBCU land-grant peers by more than $12 billion between 1987 and 2020. More than $2 billion each in Tennessee and North Carolina alone. But the school itself would not be repealed. Even after redemption, every post-1876 constitutional revision, except Alabama's, kept the direct school tax principle. Du Bois notes it became common across the South for every party to pledge itself to the public schools. And the colleges that era planted, Howard, Fisk, Atlanta, Hampton, became the seed bank, training the black teachers who kept literacy alive through the darkest decades. Du Bois's verdict is the quietest big claim in the book. He wrote, quote, "It is fair to say that the Negro carpetbag governments established the public schools of the South." End quote. If you grew up in the South and walked into a free public school, you walked into an institution those governments set in motion. So answer the question. In their few years of real political power, freed people and their allies wrote South Carolina the most liberal suffrage provisions the South had seen, and put universal public schooling into constitutions across the region, taxed property in a state where antebellum land taxes had averaged under 5 cents an acre, and did it backed by their own scarce money and their own votes, even where Northern hands raised the first scaffolding. By 1880, Du Bois notes from the state's own handbook, 33,000 plantations had become the ground under 93,000 small farmers. And in South Carolina, the state where that power ran deepest, the government was destroyed by force at the moment reform was winning, not the moment it was failing. That's what the record says. But the answer opens a contradiction, and I'm not going to smooth it over. The tool they built all of this with was handed to them as a substitute. In Du Bois's accounting, the ballot was the cheaper concession, granted because business would rather enfranchise the freedman than finance him. Sumner called the ballot a schoolmaster. He was right. And the substitution was still a swindle, because power built on paper alone could be repealed by force. And it was. So you have to hold both. The building was real, and the withheld foundation is why you inherited the building without ever learning the builders' names. It took until January of 2017 for the United States to proclaim its first national monument devoted to Reconstruction in Beaufort County, South Carolina, the same low country where the Penn School, an early school for freed people, opened at Brick Baptist Church on St. Helena Island in 1862. In March of 2019, Congress redesignated it the Reconstruction-era National Historical Park. The memory is arriving a century and a half behind the receipts. 2 readings survived this episode. In Du Bois's audit, The fall of these governments says less about the capacity of the people who ran them than about what property does when the poor tax it. In the older account, the graft itself forfeited the mandate, and that version is not stupid. Some of the stolen money was school money, though Du Bois traces most of that diversion to local white hands on the tax machinery. And the voters who could least afford it paid twice. But the clock is stubborn, and I think it settles the argument, knowing what that concedes. Take the harder version with you and argue with it. In Savannah, in January of 1865, the stalls of a slave market were pried apart to make room for school benches, for people the slave South had tried to keep from learning. They knew exactly what they were building. The question the book leaves you holding is why the federal park system needed a century and a half before it made a place to walk in and look.